Single mom hugged a stranger in a bar to avoid toxic ex-husband. Unaware he was the Mafia boss. The rain lashed relentlessly against the cracked windowpane, as if trying to force me to remember everything I had tried to outrun. October in New Orleans was cold, damp and unkind. Not unlike Eric on his worst days. Or maybe even on the days people called his best. It had been 3 months since I left Kansas City, carrying nothing but a fraying canvas bag and a fading yellow bruise under my left eye. I stood in front of the mirror, dabbing concealer with fingers that still trembled. Just temporary, I whispered to the unfamiliar reflection staring back. Those words had become a quiet prayer I recited each morning. This tiny studio apartment, with its peeling wallpaper and leaky pipes, was temporary. The nightmares, the racing heart that jolted me awake, the instinctive flinch every time a noise echoed from the hallway. All of it was just temporary. Even the copper-brown hair dye I used to mask my natural blonde was nothing more than a temporary disguise. But the fear was not temporary. The fear had begun to hollow me out day by day, creeping into every corner of my life, like it had rooted itself too deeply to ever be pulled free. I tried to steady my breath and met my own gaze again. I was no longer the woman who once dreamed of a warm and steady home, no longer the devoted nurse in the small downtown hospital. Now I was Claire Matthews, 38 years old, living in a rundown rental at the far end of the French Quarter, locking the door 3 times every night and sleeping with a fruit knife tucked beneath my pillow. This day began like all the others, with a lukewarm cup of coffee and eyes swollen from another sleepless night. But then the phone buzzed, and for the first time in a long time, a flicker of light broke through the long dark stretch. A message from Lena. She was the only person I had kept in touch with after vanishing from my old life. The one who had helped me find this place, and now, it seemed, a chance at work. She wrote that a lounge was looking for a woman who was polite, discreet, and knew how to keep her mouth shut. Vertigo, a name that sounded like it belonged to a world I never imagined stepping into. But when you have nothing left to lose, every door becomes worth trying. I turned off the phone, swept my hair to one side to hide the faint purple shadow still lingering on my cheekbone, slipped into the only black dress that hadn't fallen apart, pulled the zipper carefully to cover the old scar running down my back. The heels were worn thin but still held steady, and so did I. Steady enough, at least, to make it through the interview that afternoon. The rain hadn't let up, and as I stepped outside, pulling my thin coat tightly around me, I murmured again to myself, just temporary. But deep down, I knew, this time, maybe nothing would be temporary anymore. If you're still here, still following this story, thank you for staying with us this far. What you've just heard is only the beginning of a journey Claire Matthews never imagined she would take. And if you want to walk alongside her through the unexpected turns, the buried fears, and the quiet tenderness waiting just beyond the next bend, go ahead and subscribe to the Dear Single Mom channel now. Don't forget to like and share this video, so that more hearts in search of hope can find stories like this one. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment and let us know the city, town, or quiet corner of the world you're tuning in from. We would truly love to know that this story has touched you, even just a little. And now, let's return to what comes next. As Claire steps into Vertigo for the very first time, the place where everything begins to change. The streets of New Orleans were slick and gleaming with rain as I turned into a narrow alley that stitched the crumbling motel where I stayed to the heart of the French Quarter. Buses thundered past, spraying dirty water onto the curbs, blending into the damp air thick with exhaust fumes and the bitter scent of burnt coffee. I pulled my coat collar tighter, whispering for the 3rd time to myself that there was still time, that I could still turn back, pretend I had never seen Lena's message. But then, the screen of my phone lit up again in my pocket, as if to remind me there was no turning back. Vertigo was tucked into a corner on Royal Street, wedged between a time-worn jeweler's shop and an art gallery brimming with surrealist canvases. The sign was a simple piece of matte black metal, marked only with a single golden letter V. No name, nothing ostentatious. If you weren't looking, you'd pass it by, mistaking it for the entrance to a private residence or an upscale loft. I hesitated for a moment outside the door. The atmosphere inside seemed completely detached from the world outside. so hushed I could hear the soft thread of jazz music weaving its way through the thick pane of glass. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and pushed the door open. The reception desk was set back into a corner, golden lamplight washing over stone-gray walls, giving the space a strange blend of elegance and quiet pressure. The woman behind the desk looked me over with the seasoned eye of someone trained to assess people quickly. Yet her gaze wasn't unkind. I gave my name and said I had an appointment. Lena Torres had sent me. She gave a subtle nod, then gestured toward a door leading deeper inside. I followed her cue, my footsteps tapping lightly against the marble floor, palms already beginning to sweat. The waiting room beyond bore no resemblance to any bar I had known. Red velvet chairs, black and white portrait photographs lined the walls, each frame seeming to watch every move I made. I took a seat in the far corner, clutching my bag as my eyes darted cautiously around the space, trying not to look as nervous as I felt. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Every second stretched tight like a rope pulling around my neck. Just as I was about to rise and leave, a door on the opposite side opened. A man stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, his charcoal suit tailored perfectly to his frame, every inch of him giving the impression of deliberate design. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his eyes a steely gray blue that glanced over me only briefly, but left a chill running down my spine. He didn't offer a name, only nodded and spoke in a low, gravelly voice, inviting me in for the interview. I followed, some unnamed feeling stirring in my chest. The office was wide and simply furnished, but elegant. A desk lamp cast warm golden light across an oak desk. On the wall behind him hung a single black and white photograph of Bourbon Street from the 1960s, blurred slightly like a memory just out of reach. The man sat behind the desk and motioned for me to take the seat across from him. I introduced myself as Claire Matthews, 38 years old, a former nurse with 15 years of experience, familiar with personnel management and customer service. He didn't write anything down. He just watched me, eyes fixed in a way that made it feel like he was peeling back layers I had tried hard to bury. Part of me wanted to run, but I knew if I left, I'd return to that same apartment with its peeling wallpaper and echoing silence, return to the nightmares and the fear and the fragile version of me that was always running. When he asked why I had left my last job, I said I was looking for a new kind of stability. He didn't press further. He only gave the faintest smile, as if that answer was enough. At the end, he handed me a sheet with a schedule and said I would begin a trial shift next Wednesday. No contract, no extra requirements. When I asked who the manager was, he only lifted the corner of his mouth. You'll meet him soon enough. I stepped out of vertigo just as the rain had stopped. The wet streets shimmered under the glow of the city lights, reflections spreading across the pavement like an abstract painting. I had no idea what had just happened, nor why I had been hired so easily, but somewhere deep inside, I felt as if I had just crossed a threshold I could never return from, and that man, with eyes so cold they seemed to see straight through me, had looked into something I wasn't even sure I still possessed. As I turned to leave the lounge, my breath had yet to return to a steady rhythm. The wind swept across the rain-slicked pavement, dampening the hem of my dress with a sudden chill. But it wasn't the weather that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the man's eyes. There was something in the way he looked at me that felt like scrutiny. Not the kind you'd expect in a job interview, but the kind meant for someone hiding something significant. I walked back along Royal Street, the sound of my heels soft against the wet brick, my mind looping through everything that had just happened. There had been no questions about credentials, no skills test, not even a curious glance at why a former nurse was applying to work in a lounge. And perhaps because of that, it was even harder to understand what was really going on. The next morning, a message arrived from an unfamiliar number. Just 2 short lines. Wednesday, 6 o'clock. Wear dark colors. No signature. No instructions. But I knew without doubt that it was from Vertigo. From him. By Wednesday evening, I was back at the lounge, this time in a long-sleeved black dress. Neat and modest. My wardrobe offered few choices now. Just a handful of old clothes. But luckily the dress still fit. Lena met me at the back entrance, handed me a simple shift schedule, and guided me through a narrow hallway behind the main bar. She leaned in and whispered for me to stay quiet. My job. And not ask questions unless I was asked. Vertigo, she said. Wasn't like any place I'd worked before. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. The guests here had money and influence. They didn't want to be looked at too long. And they certainly didn't want to be remembered too clearly. I nodded, though 100 questions crowded my thoughts. At exactly 6 o'clock, my first shift began. The lighting inside the bar was soft, the scent of expensive liquor blending with oak and leather to create a strange, luxurious atmosphere. I moved past a small group seated near the jazz stage, trying to keep a smile that was measured. Not too warm, not too distant. As I was preparing my first drink, a security staff member approached and told me someone wanted to see me. No explanation, no name. I followed him through a hallway that led upstairs. The office door was already open. He was sitting there, once again in a dark suit, holding a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light and casting something unreadable across his eyes. He looked at me for a few seconds, then gestured for me to sit. Claire Matthews, he said slowly, as if testing the shape of the name in his mouth. Sounds more fitting for a nurse than someone working here. I said nothing, unsure whether it was a joke or a quiet challenge. He continued, to voice unchanged. Do you know where you're working? I answered truthfully, that I didn't know everything, but I needed the job and was willing to follow the rules. He leaned forward and set his glass on the desk. Here, he said. The past doesn't matter. What matters is how well you can keep the present hidden, and how willing you are to stay out of other people's business. Can you do that? I nodded. At that moment, I didn't fully grasp what he meant, but I understood this much. I had no room to say no. He said nothing more, just handed me a silver keycard and told me to keep it safe. It would grant access to the second floor, but only when given direct orders. Just as I turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice so low I nearly missed it. Welcome to Vertigo, Claire. I stepped out of that office with the sense that I had just passed an unnamed test. I still didn't know his name, but something in the way he watched me convinced me of one thing. That man wasn't just the owner of a bar, and if I wasn't wrong, my being here wasn't by chance. Since that meeting, I hadn't seen him again. No further instructions. No follow-up tests. Only the quiet rhythm of nightly shifts that started at 6 in the evening and often stretched past midnight, depending on how long the guests lingered. Lena taught me everything I needed to know. From how to pour a drink in Vertigo's particular style, to how to speak with my eyes instead of my voice. Here, silence was its own kind of language. Vertigo wasn't an ordinary bar. It wasn't loud. There were no drunken shouts or pounding music. Everything was deliberate, restrained, and held at a distance. Each server had a designated section. No one strayed. No one asked about the unfamiliar faces slipping in and out of the private rooms tucked behind the velvet curtains. I didn't either. I learned to avoid direct eye contact with the clientele, to bow my head at the right angle, to set glasses down softly, as if the very air in the room might shatter. After a week, I began to remember every face, every fragrance, even the particular gestures of certain regulars. Still, though I was growing accustomed to the cadence of Vertigo, I couldn't stop thinking about the man from that office on my first day. No one mentioned his name. They referred to him simply as the owner. But when they did, there was a shift in their tone, a caution in their eyes, as if saying too much or saying it the wrong way might carry consequences. I didn't know if he ever appeared on the main floor. Each night was full, my focus drawn tightly to the tasks in front of me. I never had the chance to look up long enough to find out, until one Friday night. It had rained lightly earlier that evening, and the lounge was unusually crowded. I was assigned to the high-top tables near the bar. While wiping down a marble tabletop, I felt it, that subtle shift in the room, the way air changes when someone enters without a sound, and yet the atmosphere tilts on its axis. I looked up. He was standing at the entrance. No one announced him. No one needed to. He stepped inside, and without a word, everyone seemed to know to adjust. Same dark suit, the edge of a crisp white shirt collar barely visible beneath the jacket. The overhead light caught the sharp planes of his face, making everything around him feel a few degrees colder. But it wasn't his presence that rooted me in place. It was the way his eyes settled on me. In that brief moment, the sounds of the room receded into a hush. His gaze wasn't rushed, wasn't heavy. It was quiet, steady, and impossibly deep. As if stripping away layers I didn't even know I still had. I tried to turn away, but my feet felt fastened to the damp floor. He gave a subtle nod to a nearby male server, then continued on, disappearing behind the velvet curtain that led to the second floor. The room exhaled and returned to its rhythm. But I didn't. That look stayed with me, like ink bleeding into the fibers of white paper. I couldn't explain why he looked at me that way. Maybe it was chance, or maybe it wasn't. After that night, I began to notice that he came in on Fridays, sometimes Saturdays, never with anyone, always alone. He would enter, walk through the lounge without pause, ascend the stairs, and vanish. And each time, his eyes would find me, just for a moment. No smile, no expression, but that glance clung to me through the long, silent hours of night. I told myself I was imagining it, that this was how he observed all the new hires. But the truth was, I had started waiting for it, waiting for those few seconds when our eyes would meet again. And I didn't know if that was something harmless or the beginning of something I wasn't yet ready to name. The next Friday night came sooner than I expected. The rain hadn't stopped, as if this city never truly dried. Rain in New Orleans wasn't like rain in other places. It didn't crash down. It lingered, quiet and constant, thickening the air into something close to breathless. I arrived at Vertigo 15 minutes early, my fingers numbing as they curled around the cold metal door handle. Inside, the air was the same as always, the scent of wood and leather, the slow drawl of jazz, and the soft golden light that clung to every surface like a low, ever-present fog. Lena was speaking with another server when she saw me walk in. She pointed toward a table near the front of the first floor, one of the high-top tables pressed against the glass wall. That section was usually reserved for regulars. But tonight it had been cleared, draped in white linen, set with crystal instead of glass. She pulled me aside and whispered that I would be serving the VIP table tonight. I paused for half a second, my heartbeat tightening without warning. I didn't ask questions. I only nodded. Lena gave me a look and said softly that VIP here didn't just mean rich. It meant important in a way that could make someone disappear with a single phone call. Half a joke, half a warning. Her words chilled me. I adjusted my apron and headed to the prep counter. Around 7:30, a sleek black car pulled up out front. A tall man stepped out, silver hair cropped short. His light gray suit so sharply tailored it might as well have been sewn directly onto him. Behind him came two other men, one of whom I recognized, one of the security staff I had seen once before with the owner. They said nothing. They walked quietly to the prepared table and began speaking in voices so low they barely disturbed the air. I approached with a tray of glasses, my palms slick with sweat. I bowed my head just enough, introduced myself softly, and placed the glasses down. The silver-haired man glanced up at me, his eyes neither warm nor harsh. He gave a small nod in place of thanks, then returned to the conversation. But it wasn't him that held me frozen in place. It was the man who entered a few minutes later. Nathan Hale. No announcement, no sound, just the weight of his presence as he stepped through the door. And somehow, without a word, everyone knew he had arrived. The same dark suit, the crisp edge of white collar, and that gaze, the one that always found me the moment he walked in. Again, it landed on me. Not sudden, not demanding, but steady, deep, like he was returning to a question he still hadn't answered. He said nothing as he crossed the room and took the head seat at the table, the center position. A hush spread briefly over the gathering. Like a held breath, I stood frozen, unsure of what came next. Lena motioned for me to continue. I poured more wine, trying to keep my hands steady, though they trembled beneath the strain of control. As I set the bottle down, Nathan looked at me again. This time, he didn't look through me. He looked into me, not with coldness or scrutiny, but with something quieter. More deliberate, as though he was weighing something only he understood. The silver-haired man said something in French. I didn't catch the words. But Nathan did. He replied with a short sentence, then turned to glance at me once more. I bowed my head, stepped back, and slipped behind the bar's curtain. My breath uneven, and my heart thudding like it was trying to outrun something. I didn't know what I was feeling. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. Nor was it simple unease. It was a tangle of curiosity and caution, knotted tight in the space between his stare and my response. The evening passed under a silent pressure. Each time I approached the table, Nathan's eyes followed me, calm but unrelenting. He said nothing, but there was no mistaking it. Something was happening. Something I wasn't part of, but couldn't avoid. Near midnight, the group rose from the table. Nathan was the last to stand. As he passed by me, he paused for a single second, tilted his head just slightly, not quite a nod, not quite nothing. Then he walked out the door, leaving me standing there with an empty tray gripped too tightly in my hands. In my mind, only one thought echoed, quiet but unshakable. I had just seen something I wasn't meant to see, and I was certain he knew that too. Ever since that night, I began carrying with me a strange, nameless feeling I couldn't quite define. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. And not anticipation either. But something quieter, more persistent, like the sense of being watched. Not by eyes in a room, but by something invisible, trailing just behind every step I took. It lingered beneath my skin like a low current of electricity, especially on those nights when I worked late, when the lounge emptied out and the soft light inside Vertigo faded into a haze, casting long, blurred shadows against the walls. Everything on the surface remained the same. I arrived on time. I stayed late. I kept to myself. I spoke to no one except Lena. She was still the only one who spoke to me with a tone that could be called kind, though it was the kind that always carried a warning. She reminded me not to look too long toward the second floor, not to wonder about the people who came and went from behind the curtain. But how could I not notice, when nearly every night he appeared? Nathan Hale. He no longer sat at the VIP table, but he always walked through the main floor, slow and composed, like a man with no reason to rush anything in his life. And every time, his eyes found mine, not urgently, not by accident, calmly, deliberately, with a steadiness that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I had known a gaze like that before. Eric had looked at me that way, but his eyes always carried the need to control. Nathan's didn't. His was the kind of gaze that watched. It studied, consumed not to possess, but simply to understand. With him, I felt like a page being read line by line, without a single word allowed to hide. 3 days after the VIP night, I was wiping down the bar when I heard footsteps stop behind me. I turned. It was him. No one else. No announcement. No sound. He stood there with one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass filled with that familiar amber liquid. I bowed my head slightly, ready to step aside. But his voice came, quiet and low. "How long have you worked here?" I wasn't sure if it was a real question or just a gesture of conversation. Softly, I answered, "About 2 weeks." He nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. Then his eyes locked onto mine, gray-blue in the low light, and he asked, "Are you afraid?" The question stopped me. I didn't know how to answer. Was I afraid? Yes. But the part that unsettled me most wasn't him, it was how I was beginning to feel oddly at ease in his presence. I chose the safer reply. "No. I'm used to it." One corner of his brow lifted, not quite in disbelief, not quite in approval. He took a slow sip from his glass, then said something that left me staring into the space he walked away from long after he was gone. "You shouldn't get used to things like this." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the jazz. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake in my small apartment beneath the yellowed ceiling, listening to the steady drip of water from the bathroom sink, trying to understand what he meant. Don't get used to it. Was he warning me? Was he reminding me that the world I had stepped into was unlike any I had known before? In the days that followed, he didn't speak to me again. But each time he entered the room, I felt his eyes find me first. And even when the moment passed quickly, even when he said nothing, there was something undeniable in the way he saw me, a kind of attention I couldn't ignore. And though I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself, that attention, whatever it meant, was something I had begun to wait for. I once believed I could escape Eric, that if I started a new life in a different city, cut every tie, changed my appearance, got a new phone number and lived quietly enough, the past would fail to find me. But those things only protect the people whose pasts are not driven by obsession. With Eric, I had only ever been hiding for a little while. And on that night, I understood that my borrowed time had run out. Vertigo was quieter than usual. I was wiping the counter when Lena called me to the back to help count the bottles in storage. It took less than 10 minutes. When I returned to the main room, I stepped into an air that felt suddenly heavy. A few servers glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Lena had just come back as well. Her eyes found me for a second, then shifted just as fast. Something was wrong. I moved quickly toward the bar, and I saw him, Eric. He sat alone at a table tucked in the dim corner, where the light did not fully reach, yet just bright enough for me to see every detail of his face. The same dark hair slicked back, the worn leather jacket, and that blade-sharp stare. But what froze me was not his presence. It was the slow, deliberate smile that spread across his face the moment his eyes met mine, like he had been waiting for this moment a very long time. I stepped back, my whole body turning cold. No one here knew who I really was beyond the name I had given them. Claire Matthews. But Eric knew everything. He knew who I was, who I had been, and where I had run. I turned to Lena, trying to speak, but my throat felt locked tight. She looked at me, her expression taut but controlled. She whispered, "Go to the staff room. Now." I obeyed. The small back room barely fit a chair and a filing cabinet. I sat, gripping the fabric of my dress to steady myself. 10 minutes passed, then 20. All I heard was the steady flow of jazz outside the door. Then the door opened. It was not Lena. It was Nathan. He closed the door behind him, his gaze cold and sharp as steel. He did not ask why I was frightened. He did not request an explanation. He spoke only one sentence. "Who is he?" My voice was barely a whisper. "He is someone I lived with. The reason I left Kansas City. The reason for the scar on my back." Nathan did not react immediately. He was silent for a few moments, then gave a small nod. He told me to stay seated, not to leave and not to touch the door. Then he disappeared as quietly as a cold draft slipping under the floorboards. I sat there, fingers digging crescents into my palms, feeling cornered like an animal with nowhere to run. I had no idea what was happening outside. I did not know whether Eric was being thrown out, or what Nathan intended to do. 5 minutes later, the door opened again. This time it was Lena. The calm she usually carried was gone from her face. She motioned for me to stand and told me everything had been handled. When I asked where Eric was, she answered only, "Gone. He will not come back. Do not ask again." I could not finish the shift. Lena sent me home early. I stepped out of Vertigo and walked the rain-soaked street without feeling anything but the pounding of my heart in my chest. Eric had found me, and if he had come this far, this was not going to end easily. But what unsettled me more than his return was not fear of him. It was the look in Nathan's eyes when he asked that one question. No anger, no pity, only a cold certainty. And I knew, from that moment, he had entered a part of my life I could no longer keep untouched or solely my own. I had thought that once I stepped out of Vertigo that night, things might settle, even if only briefly. That I would return to my worn-down apartment, lock the door in 3 places like always, and wait for the panic to loosen its grip. But the moment I reached the curb, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of me. The window slid down, and through the haze of streetlight and mist, I saw a familiar gaze. Nathan. He didn't ask me where I wanted to go. He simply said, "Get in." His voice was calm, even-toned, as if my standing there, trembling in the rain, was nothing unexpected. I hesitated for a beat, then climbed into the car. Not because I trusted him, not yet, but because some part of me understood that if Eric had found me once, he would not stop. And if anyone had the means to stop him, it was the man now sitting less than a meter away from me. The SUV moved smoothly through the quiet streets, slipping past the edges of the warehouse district and turning down a shaded road tucked behind old oak trees. No signs, no neon, no sound beyond the steady sweep of tires on wet asphalt. The building we arrived at rose from the pavement in stone and glass, tall and expressionless, the kind of place that didn't need to be advertised. The security guards at the entrance didn't ask names. They simply nodded, pressed a button to open the gate, and bowed slightly as Nathan drove into the underground garage. I stayed silent the whole way, not asking where we were going, not pretending to be strong. I simply folded my hands in my lap, lacing my fingers together, trying to keep the trembling at bay. When the car came to a stop, Nathan opened his door first and motioned for me to follow. We stepped into a private elevator, rising all the way to the top floor. The penthouse opened into a space so still, so carefully measured, it almost didn't feel real. Soft lighting glowed from ceiling fixtures, reflecting off polished wood floors. The living room stretched toward a wall of glass, revealing a balcony and a sweeping view of the city below. Everything was restrained, clean, controlled. Even the silence felt designed. I stood at the threshold, afraid I might disturb it. Nathan slipped off his coat and hung it carefully before turning to me. "You can't go back," he said. "He knows where you live now." I hesitated, my voice low. "I can find another place. I don't want to impose." He shook his head. "It's not about imposing. It's about safety. There will be security here. No one gets in unless I allow it." I looked at him, uncertain what unsettled me more, his certainty, or the way his eyes told me he already knew I wouldn't say no. He led me down a hallway to a small bedroom at the far end. It was simple. A large bed covered in white linens, thick curtains drawn across the windows, and a narrow desk tucked against the wall. The adjoining bathroom was bright and spotless, almost cold in its order. I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know whether to thank you or be afraid." He stood leaning against the doorway, his gaze softer now. "You don't owe me anything, but if you're going to stay here, there's one rule: no lies." I nodded. I didn't know why that particular condition made something inside me ease, but it did, as if gratitude was optional. But honesty wasn't. "Before leaving," he added, "the door locks from the inside. You can sleep without worry. I won't come in unless you ask me to." I stood there long after he left. The room was so quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. For the first time in weeks, I didn't lock 3 bolts, didn't sleep with a knife beneath my pillow. And still, I was able to close my eyes without seeing Eric's face in the dark. Maybe it was because I was high above the city, where the streets were nothing more than dim strands of light far below. Or maybe it was because that man, in some quiet, resolute way, had made me believe that at least for tonight I would be safe. The first days living in Nathan's penthouse passed quietly, almost distantly, like I was moving through a life that didn't fully belong to me. I still worked my shifts at Vertigo as usual, tied the apron around my waist, poured drinks with steady hands, and kept my voice low, my posture precise. But every night, when I stepped through those glass doors high above the city, I felt something shift. It was as if I were moving between 2 different worlds. One was the bar, filled with unfamiliar eyes and the low pulse of jazz echoing through the walls. A place where I had to hold my shoulders firm, keep my breath measured, and never let my guard down. The other was a space so calm it felt unreal, with warm wood beneath my feet and the sound of wind brushing across the balcony like a lullaby I had never known in my life. Nathan didn't interfere with my routine. He set no rules beyond the one he had made clear from the beginning. No lies. He moved through the penthouse like a presence with purpose. Each morning, he was gone before I woke. The only trace of his departure, the soft click of the door, and the echo of his shoes fading down the hallway. He returned late, often after I had already turned off the lights. But sometimes, We found ourselves sitting down to dinner at the long wooden table that held only 2 seats set side by side. At first, there was silence. I ate without speaking, and he didn't try to fill the quiet. But gradually, the silence changed. Small questions began to surface. Gently, almost casually. What do you like for breakfast? What kind of books do you read? Have you ever thought about returning to medicine? They weren't probing, and they didn't feel like tests. They were simple, like he was trying to sketch the outline of someone time had worn thin. I began to answer, little by little, not out of obligation, but because, somehow, I wanted him to know. And in some strange way, it became easier to breathe when he was near. Some nights I sat on the balcony with a cup of hot tea in hand, and he would come out too, standing just a few steps away, looking out over the city as though nothing out there could surprise him anymore. One evening, I asked him why he helped me. He didn't answer right away, just took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Because not everyone gets the right to be forgotten. His words left me silent for a long time. I understood then he didn't just see me as a woman who had been hurt, or as a quiet employee in his polished lounge. He saw the things I tried to bury. In the nights that followed, we began to share meals more regularly. He took me to a small bookstore tucked into the corner of a narrow alley, where I found a worn novel I'd loved back in college. We didn't talk much while we were out, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt safe, familiar. I started sleeping better. I no longer needed the knife under my pillow. I didn't wake with a scream trapped in my throat. One morning, a vase of fresh flowers appeared in the living room, though I never asked who had placed it there. My towel was replaced with one softer, warmer, in the exact shade I preferred. Small things, thoughtful things, and little by little, this apartment stopped feeling like a place I was merely passing through. And Nathan, though still calm, still unreadable, no longer felt like a shadow haunting the edge of my thoughts. I didn't know who he truly was. Not yet. I didn't know what filled the pages of his past. But I knew this much. In those first days when I was trying to step out from under the weight of fear, he was the only one who stood there. He didn't ask me to hurry. He didn't demand strength I didn't have. He just stayed. And for me, that was enough to begin trusting. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to stay. It wasn't until the 6th night of living in Nathan's penthouse that I happened to see the first crack in him. Not a break in his voice or the way he moved, he never allowed that. It was in his eyes. That night, vertigo had closed later than usual, and by the time I returned, dawn was close. The lights were still on inside the apartment, something I rarely saw. Nathan typically disappeared into his study after dark, but this time, he was sitting alone in the living room, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, one arm resting on the edge of the leather chair, a half-finished glass of whiskey in his hand. The warm light fell across his face, and for the first time, it wasn't sharp or unreadable. It was still, heavy, as if he were looking through the city and seeing something far older than its skyline. I hesitated, about to slip quietly into my room so as not to disturb him, when I heard his voice low, steady, but without its usual certainty. Claire. It was the first time he had spoken to me like that at this hour. I stepped closer and sat across from him. Is everything all right? His gaze didn't move from the glass window stretching behind him. Do you see that street down there? I followed his line of sight, beyond the glass, to a narrow road swallowed by the shadows of nearby buildings, dimly lit by fading amber streetlights. I see it. He set his glass down with a soft clink. She used to love watching it. My sister. I said nothing, not out of surprise, but because he spoke her name like she still lived in that room. Like her presence hadn't quite left. Sophia. That was her name. He had never mentioned family before. Once. In Vertigo. I heard someone say a woman's name in passing and watched Nathan fall so silent the air seemed to freeze. Sophia was 5 years younger than me. He said. We grew up in the south end of the city. Not rich. Not poor. Just ordinary. My father worked for a shipping company. My mother was a cashier at a supermarket. Sophia was the stubborn one. She loved piano. Hated theory. preferred climbing fences with the neighbor kids to wearing a dress to school events. I smiled quietly, and Nathan returned a faint one of his own, but it faded almost immediately. She was 19 when she met the wrong man. My heart slowed. An older man, wealthy, called himself a businessman. At first, he was charming, generous, bought her things. She thought she'd found a way out. His voice dropped. Then came the control. The isolation. He made her believe no one else cared. My skin went cold. His story brushed too close to wounds I hadn't finished stitching. When she tried to leave, he scared her. My mother wanted to call the police, but Sophia begged her not to, said no one would believe her. Nathan's eyes flickered. Just barely. One winter night, she came home. Her face was swollen, eyes red. I asked who did it. She cried and said nothing. I called the police. They said they needed proof. She got scared. Went back to him a few days later. He exhaled, the kind of breath that carried years of silence. A week later, they found her in an abandoned apartment near the center of the city. They said she ended it herself. But I know, no one who wants to live chooses to leave unless they've been pushed to the edge of something that doesn't look like life anymore. I pressed my palms into my lap, fingernails digging into skin. She left a note. Just a few words. I miss you. Nothing about him. No rage. No demand for revenge. Just one thread trying to tie the living back to her one last time. He looked at me then, not guarded or unreadable, but with the shimmer of someone who has trained himself never to cry where anyone might see. I couldn't save her. Claire. I thought I was strong. I thought I understood how this world worked, but I was too late. Then he smiled. The kind that cuts inward. That's why I built Vertigo. Not just for profit, but for people like Sophia, people like you. People who need a place where no one sees them as victims, where no one asks too much. But if something happens, someone will stand. I looked at him for a long time. The shield he carried wasn't made of cold detachment. It was forged from a grief deeper than any wound I had ever seen. He turned back to the city. I can't bring her back. But if I can keep someone else standing, I will, no matter what this world wants to think of me. I didn't say anything. I simply placed my hand on the table, close to his, not touching, just near enough for him to know I was there. And for the first time since I had stepped foot into this apartment, Nathan looked at me not as someone he needed to protect, but as someone who could understand him, someone who could hold what he wasn't ready to name aloud. I no longer saw him as a shadow in the dark. I saw his heart, raw and fractured in ways he had never let anyone witness. And I knew, sooner or later, that heart would draw me closer, not with power, not with control, but with the kind of pain only those who have truly lost something can recognize. Since the night Nathan told me about Sophia, the space between us seemed to disappear without a word. There was no conversation, no declaration that something had changed. Yet I felt the shift subtle but unmistakable in every glance, every shared breath when we were near each other. Dinner was no longer a quiet routine at opposite ends of the table. Between simple meals came stories of books he once read, places I had dreamed of visiting, small habits we both discovered we had in common. I learned he preferred his coffee black, no sugar, but every morning he would still add sugar to mine without asking. He learned I often woke in the middle of the night, so he kept the hallway light on, never once turning it off. One evening, I came home late from Vertigo to find him asleep on the couch, the television still glowing. I moved quietly to turn it off, draped a blanket over him, and turned to leave, but his eyes opened, clear and steady, not groggy in the least. Claire. That was all he said. Just my name. But in that moment, the sound of it carried a softness I hadn't known his voice could hold. I paused, uncertain, and then he reached out, not commanding, not expectant, just a quiet invitation. I sat beside him, and we stayed there until morning, nothing more than stillness between us. And yet, I had never felt such peace in years. Slowly, I stopped seeing him as the man who saved me from Eric, or the enigmatic owner of Vertigo, or even the figure who moved through power with silent precision. He became simply Nathan, a man who once loved a younger sister with all his heart, a man who knew what it meant to lose, and still chose to believe there were good things left in this world worth protecting. I began telling him things I had never shared. About the first night Eric hit me, and how I forgave him. About the third time he took my phone and read through every message, and how I convinced myself that it was love. About the way I once believed if I just became smaller, fire, more obedient, he would return to being the man I had met at the beginning. Nathan never interrupted. He never looked at me with pity. He just listened. And when I cried, he didn't offer platitudes or reach for heroism. He only moved a little closer. Close enough that I knew I didn't have to go through it alone anymore. The night we shared our first kiss began the way many others had, in quiet. I had just stepped out of the bathroom. Hair still damp, robe resting over my shoulders. He stood in the kitchen, making me a cup of hot cocoa, just as he always did. When he handed it to me, our hands brushed only slightly, but something in that touch made me look up. Our eyes met, and for the first time, I saw no distance in his gaze, no guarded edge, just presence. He asked, softly, "May I kiss you? For someone else?" That question might have been a formality, but to me, it was sacred. It meant that he saw me not as something to be taken, but as someone whose yes mattered. I nodded. So faintly it might have been missed by anyone else. But Nathan saw. He leaned in slowly, his mouth touching mine with a gentleness that nearly undid me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't demanding. It was quiet, steady, deep in a way that made my chest ache, because no one had ever kissed me like that. Not out of desire to own me, but out of a need to touch the place where pain had begun to heal. When we pulled away, he said nothing. He simply leaned his forehead against mine, and we stayed like that, our breath mingling, our scars no longer defining us but quietly coexisting with something new, something wordless and real. That night, I fell asleep in his arms. No dreams, no nightmares, just warmth, the kind I once believed I had lost forever. And I knew then we had crossed a threshold we couldn't return from, not because of a kiss, but because for the first time, we had let each other see everything. No hiding, no pretending, no rush, just two people, once broken, learning how to stay, and believing, even in the quiet, that what we were beginning to feel had already taken root. The message arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen, making coffee. Sunlight filtering through the tall windows and glinting off the rim of the cream-colored porcelain cup Nathan always used. My phone buzzed against the countertop. Just one short line from an unfamiliar number. * Eric is dead. I froze, the spoon still in my hand, a sudden chill blooming in the center of my chest. I read the words again, hoping I had misunderstood. But no, they were still there, clear. Final. Like a clean, unflinching cut across the skin. I didn't know how long I stood there. The coffee spilled over the edge of the cup, dripping onto the counter, then falling in soft, steady drops to the wooden floor. Nathan appeared behind me. He stopped when he saw me, motionless, staring, without a word. He approached, gently took the phone from my hand, glanced at the screen. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes narrowed slightly. Barely, but enough for me to know he had expected this. I stepped back, dizzy, as if the room had tilted and gravity had suddenly vanished. * You knew. * I said, the words tumbling out before I could think. He didn't deny it. Claire. I raised a hand. Don't say my name right now. I want the truth. He stayed still, calm as ever, unshaken, even when the air between us crackled with everything I could no longer contain. He hurt you. He said. He would have done it again. And next time, it could have been the last. I let out a sharp laugh, bitter and ragged, a sound that felt like it belonged to someone else. So you killed him, or gave the order. What's the difference? I didn't do it myself, but I let it happen. He said. His voice wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. But each word landed with the weight of stone. Because I couldn't let him come back. Not again. I looked at him and saw a man I suddenly couldn't recognize. I had always known Nathan wasn't simple. I had always known Vertigo was more than just a bar. But I hadn't let myself imagine this. Asterisk. Or maybe I had and chose to believe he would stop somewhere short of this line. I turned to walk away. But my knees buckled. Nathan caught me instinctively. One arm around my shoulder the way he had so many times before. But this time, I didn't lean into him. I pulled away, gasping for air. Asterisk, I don't know what to feel. Nathan. Asterisk, I said, my voice shaking. Asterisk, I don't know if I should feel safe, or if I've just become part of something I can't control. He didn't follow. He stood where I left him. You're shaking. Asterisk, he said quietly. Asterisk, I know. But I need you to listen. Asterisk, I didn't do this out of power. Or anger. Or ego. I did it because I knew deep down you would never truly be free while he still existed in this world. I collapsed into a chair, my hands clutching the sides of my head. Part of me times understood. Asterisk, God help me. I understood. But another part, one still raw from years of control and silence, screamed that I had just lost my choice all over again. I shot up, my eyes burning. Asterisk, what about me? Asterisk, I cried. Asterisk, did anyone ask what I wanted? If I was ready to hear that the man who broke me is dead. Nathan took a slow step forward. Asterisk, I didn't think you would want to know ahead of time, and I knew you'd torment yourself if the choice had been yours, so I took that weight. But I didn't ask you to. Asterisk, I shouted, the pain breaking through my ribs like something tearing loose. Asterisk, I didn't need another man deciding what's best for me. Not again. He didn't answer. He didn't argue. He just stood there, eyes locked on mine, unmoving. I turned my back on him and walked to my room, slamming the door behind me, then sliding to the floor like a child who no longer had the strength to pretend they were grown. The ache wasn't because Eric was dead. It was because I knew times that I would never be able to look at Nathan the same way again. I had once believed love could grow from safety, but love, I was learning, is more fragile than that. It needs trust. And now, that trust was cracking. Quietly. Slowly. Even as my heart still wanted to believe he had done it for me. I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. And I didn't know if I ever would be. I left the penthouse on a gray afternoon, when the rain had just stopped, and the streets of Chicago still held shimmering puddles like scattered fragments of a broken mirror. I did not warn him. Did not leave a note. I simply folded my few belongings into an old suitcase, gathering the warm evenings, the gentle touches, the first kiss, and tucking them into the creases of memory. No one tried to stop me. No voice called after me to say I was wrong or to beg me to stay. Nathan did not appear in the doorway, did not argue, did not ask. Perhaps he already knew, or perhaps he chose to honor the silence I left behind. My new apartment sat in a low building on the west side of the city. Not far from Vertigo, but far enough that it felt like stepping into a different life. It was small, with one bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a window that faced a narrow alleyway. The walls carried faint stains of years gone by. The floor sighed beneath each step, and the faucet dripped with stubborn persistence. As if counting the seconds of my solitude, I sat on the floor among unopened boxes, looking around and trying to convince myself that this was home. But all I felt was emptiness filling each corner like a slow tide. There was no scent of morning coffee drifting through the air, no golden light spilling from a hallway lamp, no steady footfalls just beyond the wall each night. Everything was so quiet it felt cold. I did not cry, not because I was strong, but because exhaustion hollowed me out. I believed leaving would free me, that reclaiming my autonomy would feel like breathing again. Yet here, alone in the stillness, I realized that freedom can feel like another kind of cage, one whose door I locked myself. The days that followed moved with a heavy slowness. I still worked at Vertigo, still greeted Lena with a familiar nod, still kept my eyes from drifting toward the second floor as if it were a place forbidden. Nathan did not appear. No gaze from the dark corner of the room tracked my movements. No message arrived. No call came. He slipped from my orbit as seamlessly as he had entered. It should have brought relief. Strangely, instead, whenever I turned from the front bar, I found myself glancing toward the door, half expecting his silhouette, though knowing he would not come. One evening in a grocery store, I saw a man from behind in a gray coat so like his. It stole my breath for a heartbeat. I followed 2 steps before he turned, his face a stranger's. I laughed quietly to myself, embarrassed and aching. I understood then that I had not only left Nathan, but also walked away from the fragile version of myself that had just begun to trust again. The new apartment stayed unchanged through the week. The same harsh white light, the same drip of water, the same me. Sitting each night with a cup of tea grown cold, staring at a narrow sliver of sky between tired rooftops. One night, I scrolled through the photos taken during the days in his home. A cup of cocoa on the counter, a book folded open on the sofa arm, a bundle of dried lavender hanging near the window. They felt like someone else's life. I turned off the screen and leaned against the wall. And for the first time since walking out, I let myself cry. Not out of regret, but grief. I grieved that 2 people who had climbed out of such deep shadows could not hold on to each other once they found a place that felt safe. And I grieved that although I had escaped Eric, I could not yet escape myself. I ran into Mia on a late afternoon while standing in line for coffee near the train stop. The city was wrapped in a light veil of mist, winter settling in, bare tree branches swaying gently in the cold wind. I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was shorter now, dyed a warm chestnut brown instead of the honey blonde I remembered, but her smile hadn't changed. It was just as sudden and just as warm, like no time had passed between us. Mia had been my classmate in our first year of nursing school. She was the one who walked me home after a night I drank too much following a fight with my mother. The one who once said that life doesn't heal anyone completely, but we can learn to live with the scars. We hugged tightly, as if needing the pressure to remind ourselves we were still real, still standing. After all the years spent drifting in different directions, I didn't ask why she was in Chicago. She didn't ask why I looked like someone who had just walked out of a dusty old chapter. We simply sat at a small cafe on the corner, ordered 2 cups of hot cocoa, and began again as if no distance had ever existed. I told her everything, nothing held back, from the early days of living in fear to the moment I first stepped into vertigo, from meeting Nathan to the months in the penthouse, to the night I finally walked away. Mia didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp or offer dramatics. She listened as if every piece I gave her was a part of a puzzle she had always been waiting to understand. When I finally stopped, she let out a long breath, reached across the table, and took my hand. Asterisk, do you know how strong you are? Asterisk, she said. Asterisk, no one walks away from safety, not when they've been hurt before. But you did. And the fact that you feel pain, that you're unsure, that you feel empty, that's not weakness. That's what healing looks like. What's remarkable is that you're still here, still breathing, still telling your story without blaming anyone. I smiled. For the first time in days, it didn't feel forced. Mia had always been the kind of person who could make even the grayest day feel a little lighter, and I felt a quiet gratitude for running into her just now, just when I needed it. Before we parted, she asked if I needed anything. I shook my head. Asterisk, just time. Asterisk, I said. Asterisk, and maybe a reason to believe again. She hugged me once more, then walked toward the bus stop. I stood watching until her figure disappeared into the blur of passers-by, then turned back toward my small apartment. There was an envelope in my mailbox. No name on it. No return address. Inside was a small silver key, tied with an old piece of leather cord. No note, no explanation. But I knew. The way it fit perfectly in my palm. The way the metal gleamed under the stairwell light. It was just like the key I'd once seen clipped to Nathan's coat pocket. A custom key, not meant for any ordinary door. Unless that door had once belonged to you. I closed my fingers around it, the cold of the metal slowly warming in my hand. Nathan hadn't written a word, hadn't asked me to come back, hadn't said he missed me. He had only sent a key, a quiet message, if you want to. The door is still there, not locked, not open, just waiting for someone brave enough to try again. That night, I placed the key in the drawer beside my bed, not to hide it, but to remind myself that some people don't disappear, even when they go quiet. And some connections, once they've been made, don't dissolve easily, no matter how much time or distance tries to cover them in dust. I returned to Vertigo on a Friday night, just as the first soft strains of jazz began to float down from the ceiling speakers, and the bar slowly filled with its familiar hush of conversation and clinking glasses. Lena looked at me with surprise, but she said nothing. She simply handed me an apron, as if I had never left. My hands trembled slightly as I tied the strings behind my back, and my heartbeat skipped unevenly as I stepped over the threshold into the main lounge. Everything was exactly as it had been. The polished wood floors gleamed under warm, dim light, the scent of oak-aged liquor mixed with the expensive perfume of regular patrons. I kept my eyes low, away from the second floor, away from the office that still sat hidden behind frosted glass and a door that never opened. For the first 3 hours, I moved like a machine. Orders, drinks, wiping down tables. When someone called my name, I smiled. When someone asked where I'd been, I only said I'd had some personal matters to take care of. No one pressed further. Maybe they'd heard something, or maybe they were just the kind of people who understood when not to ask. Close to midnight, I was polishing a glass at the far end of the bar when Lena approached, her voice low. Asterisk, someone wants to see you. Asterisk, I glanced at her. Uncertain. Asterisk, where? She didn't answer, only gestured toward the back. I stepped out through Vertigo's rear exit into the private lot reserved for high-ranking staff and VIP guests. The air was colder than I remembered. Wind from the river bit into my skin, and I shivered. That was when I saw the black SUV parked in the far corner, near the moss-covered brick wall. The window lowered slowly. Nathan. He wasn't wearing one of his long coats tonight, just a white shirt. Sleeves rolled. Tie loosened. He looked tired. Older. There were silver strands in his hair I hadn't noticed before. I stopped a few feet from the car. I didn't move closer, and he didn't step out. We stood there, watching each other across the stillness, like strangers who once knew each other by heart. I didn't know if he saw the silver key around my neck, strung on a delicate leather cord, but his eyes shifted slightly when they caught the glint of metal. He was the one who spoke first. "Are you all right?" His voice was low, rough at the edges. I gave a small nod. Asterisk, didn't think you'd come back. Asterisk, he said. I met his gaze. Steady. Asterisk, I'm not sure I ever really left. He nodded. And in that movement I saw it the way he was reading me. Carefully. Like tracing over old bruises without pressing too hard. The key. I knew he would mention it. Asterisk, I kept it. Asterisk, I said before he could. Asterisk. But keeping it doesn't mean I've forgiven you. Asterisk, I know. Asterisk. There was no defense in his voice. Asterisk, I'm not waiting for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know if there ever comes a day when you need a place to return to. It's still there. You don't have to knock. I turned away, then back again. Asterisk, I still don't understand why you did it without asking me. I still feel like you took the choice away. He didn't answer at first. A dry leaf tumbled between us, carried by the wind, spinning once before settling at our feet. Finally, he spoke. Asterisk, you once told me you never wanted anyone to decide for you again, and you were right. But sometimes, people do things they know won't be forgiven, just to protect the one thing they can't bear to lose. He paused. Asterisk, you weren't part of any plan. Claire, you were what I never expected, and I was afraid. Afraid to lose you the same way I lost Sophia. Something pulled tight in my chest, not out of pain, but because I saw it then. Not fear of enemies, not fear of failure, but the raw, human fear of being left behind. I stepped closer to the SUV, standing beside the window that was still lowered. Asterisk, if you were really afraid of losing me. Asterisk, I said. Asterisk, then don't just stand still when I'm about to walk away. He looked at me, and the steel in his eyes had softened. Asterisk, I didn't stand still. Asterisk, he said. Asterisk, I sent the key. I laughed. Just barely. But it was enough. Enough to melt the frost between us. I'm still angry. I said quietly. Asterisk, but I'm still here. The words hung between us like an unfinished promise. Nathan didn't reach for my hand. He didn't open the car door. He simply offered one final sentence before I turned to go. Asterisk, when you're ready. The door is open. And this time, it doesn't need to be locked. I walked back into Vertigo, where the light inside was warmer than the chill outside, but my heart didn't feel as cold as before. Maybe because I knew this reunion wasn't an ending. It was a place where something could begin again. Carefully, slowly, but with enough truth in it to make space for hope. I returned to the penthouse on a Sunday afternoon, when the last light of day stretched across the city like a thin silk cloth laid gently over every rooftop and street. Nathan was not home. The place was as tidy as when I last walked away. Nothing disturbed except for a dried flower arrangement newly placed on the dining table, and a teacup on the kitchen counter still holding a trace of steam, as though he had just stepped out and might walk back in at any moment. I sat down on the sofa and looked around, feeling like a stranger in a place that once felt deeply familiar. Not 10 minutes passed before the door opened. Nathan stepped inside, paused at the doorway when he saw me. He did not speak at first, only removed his coat, hung it neatly, then walked toward me, keeping just enough distance so I would not feel cornered. I spoke before he could. I want to talk. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. He gave a slight nod. I am listening. I held his gaze for a long moment, no longer choosing the comfort of looking away. If we continue, if I stay, things cannot remain the same. I cannot live in a place where I never know what happens behind closed doors. I cannot love someone I must constantly guess about, wondering what they are hiding. He nodded again, slowly. I understand. But there is something I need to say. There are things you will not want to know, and will not need to know. Not because I do not trust you, but because I do not want you to carry burdens I am still trying to outrun myself. I clenched my hands. I do not need you to tell me every detail about the world you are trying to shield me from. But I need honesty. If you do something that affects me, my life, then I need to know first. I need the choice. He sat down across from me, the sunset pouring through the glass behind him and touching the silver at his temples with a soft glow. Very well, he said. I promise. No hiding. No deciding for you. But if there comes a moment when I must act before you understand, you must allow me the chance to explain afterward. I nodded. Agreed. And there is something else. I do not want to be only someone you protect. I am not the frightened girl who walked into a bar running from her past. I want to build something with you. Not only a relationship, a life that is real. Nathan was silent for a long moment. His eyes never left mine, as if reading every quiet shift in my expression. At last, he asked, "Are you sure you are ready? This world is not easy. A man like me is not easy to love." I smiled, soft but certain. No one is easy to love when they carry a past, but that does not mean they are unworthy of love. He leaned back, and for the first time since I returned, I saw his shoulders drop, as though some invisible weight had finally loosened its hold. "Then we start again," he said. "From the beginning, not as owner and employee, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people." I moved closer and extended my hand. "Reset." He took my hand, firm, and this time, there would be no secrets, no long silences, only the present, and a choice we both made with clear eyes and open hands. When I looked into his eyes, I no longer saw the layers of concealment that once frightened me. I saw a man who had lost too much, who had loved imperfectly but earnestly, and I knew that if we began here, then this time, we would walk forward side by side, no one leading, no one falling behind, simply together, breathing in the same quiet rhythm. They lived together once more. But this time, neither of them called it coming back. There was no grand gesture, no orchestrated act of reconciliation. It was just that the next morning, when I woke up, the right side of the closet had been cleared. The drawer in the nightstand was no longer locked, and there were 2 toothbrushes instead of 1 in the bathroom. Everything was subtle, almost incidental, but I knew he had thought through each detail. This time, living together did not feel like taking shelter. It felt like two people genuinely learning how to share a life, its rhythms, its boundaries, and even the unnamed fears that still lingered quietly between them. It began with mornings that were no longer silent. Nathan made coffee. I toasted bread. He read the news while I played soft music that drifted through the apartment like something clean and cool. I did not ask about the late-night phone calls, nor did I question the times he left and came back while the sky was still dark. But unlike before, this time, he spoke, not in detail, but just enough to let me know he was trying to keep me from building stories in my head. Once, he told me he would be away for 3 days and might not be reachable. I simply nodded and said, "As long as you come back. I won't ask about the rest." And when he returned, I did not press. Instead, I made chicken soup, the kind he once told me his mother used to make when it rained. He didn't thank me in words, but I saw the way his eyes softened. The same way they had that first night. I touched the scar he kept hidden in his heart. Of course, there were moments of difficult silence. One evening, I was angry when he canceled dinner without a word. One morning, I woke early to find him staring at his laptop, his face colder than I had ever seen it. But instead of retreating, I stayed. I did not leave, and he did not push me away. One evening, after we finished clearing the table, I said, "I have never trusted anyone like this before." He looked at me, his eyes gentler than even the amber glow of the room. "Me neither," he replied. And maybe that's the most terrifying part, because when you truly trust someone, you allow them to touch the most fragile part of you. We no longer spoke of the past. We didn't bring up Eric, or the sleepless nights, or the silver key. But the silence around those things didn't feel like denial. It felt like we had set them down where they belonged, behind us. Each day became a new chance to learn one another. Nathan began asking more. About the dreams I had as a child. About the things I disliked about myself. About scents that made me feel safe. About the colors that calmed me. I told him about the orange bicycle I used to ride in circles around the backyard every summer afternoon in Milwaukee. About the time I nearly drowned, but ended up learning how to breathe underwater, like life was teaching me survival before it taught me how to live. One day, I asked him, "If you weren't doing what you do now, what would you want to be?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Maybe I'd grow grapes somewhere sunny." I laughed. "I don't think you're suited for something that gentle," he said. "Sometimes the things we aren't suited for are exactly what we need most." And I knew he was talking about both of us. And I am learning to believe that no matter how dark the road behind us has been, there can still be a stretch ahead lit not by certainty, but by trust, by choice, and by the quiet, persistent effort of two people who once believed they were too broken to ever love again. Claire's becoming the manager of Vertigo didn't unfold with a formal announcement or a tense boardroom decision like the stories people often expect. It began with small things. Quiet shifts so subtle they might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying close attention. First, when Lena took a few weeks off to care for her ailing mother, Claire was asked by Nathan to help coordinate shifts and oversee the bar. Then came her initiative, adjusting the scheduling board, softening the lighting in the lounge to make the space feel warmer, and suggesting live music on Thursday nights, an idea that later led to a noticeable increase in revenue. Nathan observed everything from a distance. He didn't interfere, didn't suggest, but every time she asked for his opinion, he listened with intent. One evening, while they were sitting on the penthouse balcony, Claire turned to him and asked, "If I really were to run Vertigo, would you let me do it my way?" Nathan simply smiled and poured her another glass of wine. "I've been waiting for you to ask me that for quite some time." And the very next day, her name appeared on the internal roster as the general manager. No one was surprised. In fact, many had been expecting it. The staff respected her not only because she was capable and attentive, but because she managed to preserve a sense of fairness in a place that always shimmered with glamour and carried an undercurrent of mystery. Under Claire's guidance, the bar began to change. Piece by piece, she had the darker corners of the hallway repainted in a smoky shade of blue that softened the space. She replaced several older cocktail recipes with gentler ones tailored to the older women in their clientele. Most notably, she retrained the entire floor staff not to force smiles, but to learn how to read a room, how to truly see people rather than performing service as a routine. Nathan never interfered. He spent most of his time on the second floor, where meetings and decisions, always layered with complexity, continued behind closed doors. But he was always there when Claire needed him. When she struggled with new suppliers, he handed her a list of trusted names he had once worked with. When she had difficulty hiring new staff, he made a call to a bartending school and offered recommendations. It wasn't interference. It was partnership. Every night, when the last guest had left, they would walk through the bar together, checking corners, adjusting details. Some nights Claire would lean her head on his shoulder as they sorted through stock in the back. Other nights Nathan would sit at the bar, sipping whiskey slowly, watching her rearrange paperwork. They didn't need to speak much. They understood that the presence of the other was the calmest part of a space always filled with laughter, low lighting, and half-finished stories. One night, Claire asked if he had ever imagined Vertigo becoming anything more than a place to hide secrets. He replied, "If it could become a place where someone begins again, then that's already more than I ever planned." She nodded, understanding better than ever that what they were building wasn't just a business. It was a place, a shelter, a room where someone could walk in weary and leave with a flicker of hope. Beneath the soft lighting and slow music, Claire wasn't just the manager of Vertigo. She had become its heartbeat. And beside her, Nathan was no longer simply the powerful man cloaked in shadows. He was her counterpart, the stillness in the life of a woman who once believed she would always remain broken. Vertigo, under their care, was more than a venue. It became proof that a life could be rebuilt from ruin, as long as someone was patient enough to stay, and someone else brave enough to begin. Claire's parents came to Chicago on a weekend in early spring, when the air still carried a touch of chill, but the light had already begun to soften. Her mother called a week in advance, her voice light, almost hesitant, as though afraid her daughter might say no. They were thinking of visiting for a few days, she said. If Claire didn't mind. Claire agreed. Her heart, a quiet knot of anticipation and uncertainty. It had been nearly 3 years since she'd last returned to Milwaukee, and every phone call since had circled safely around topics like health, work, and the kind of stories that don't reach too far into the heart. She had never said much about Nathan, not because she feared disapproval, but because she simply didn't know where to begin explaining a man who had once been a stranger and had since become her safest place. When they arrived, Nathan wasn't home. Claire had arranged for them to stay at her old apartment, now cleaned and filled with the scent of cinnamon and the simple grace of fresh flowers on the dining table. She wanted them to feel at ease, but not overwhelmed by ceremony. On the first day, she took them on a quiet walk around the city, stopped by a riverside cafe, and in the late afternoon brought them by Vertigo so they could see where she worked. Her mother looked around, slightly surprised by the bar's polished elegance, but said little. Her father was more reserved, nodding with a quiet approval as he watched the way Claire's coworkers respected her, the way customers greeted her with warmth. On the second day, Nathan invited them for dinner at the penthouse. Claire was more anxious than she let herself admit. She wasn't sure how her parents would react to him, not because of his past or his position, but because Nathan wasn't someone who endeared himself easily on first impression. But when the door opened and he greeted them with a firm handshake, a smile that was restrained but sincere, and the quiet thoughtfulness of pulling out a chair for her mother before pouring her father a glass of wine, Claire realized some things didn't need to be explained. They could be felt. During dinner, the conversation stayed light. They spoke of Midwestern dishes, of Milwaukee's stubborn weather, and of the time Claire tried to cook and ended up burning an entire pot. Nathan didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always a small, easy story, laced with dry humor and none of the self-importance that often clings to men in powerful roles. Her mother laughed more than Claire had expected. Her father nodded often, especially when Nathan shared that he had once worked as a line cook in a tiny Boston restaurant to pay his way through school. Later, after her parents had gone, Claire stood on the balcony with Nathan, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. "I thought they'd be colder," she said. Nathan looked at her, his expression softened by the city's golden twilight. "I don't think it's possible not to love a woman as strong as you," he said quietly. She turned to him, her voice steady. "They asked me something on the way out. They asked if you were the last man I'd ever love." Eggs. Nathan didn't answer immediately. He seemed to weigh his words, then placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "And what did you say?" he asked. Claire looked out over the city, where the headlights below pulsed like the rhythm of a giant, breathing heart. "I said, if there was ever someone who made me consider marriage again, after everything, it would be the man who waits for me every night but never tries to hold me back when I'm not ready." Instinctive. Nathan didn't reply. He only drew her a little closer and said, softly, "If the day comes when you're ready, I'll be there, not to pull you, but to walk beside you. Everyone." In that moment, Claire understood something she hadn't before. Love isn't a promise to stay forever. It's a promise to listen, to wait, to build together, even if only piece by piece. And she knew that if, one day, a ring did find its way to her finger, it would not be because someone placed it there for her. It would be because she chose it, because her heart had finally learned to believe it was strong enough to hold on. Certainly, as your Vietnamese English translation specialist with a focus on emotionally resonant, psychologically rich storytelling for a mature American audience, particularly those over 45, I will now translate your text into natural, image-rich English prose. The tone will be slow, thoughtful, and evocative, following your instructions precisely, with no omissions, no embellishments, no formatting symbols, no dashes, and all numbers written out in full. Here is the complete translation as one seamless paragraph. It was a quiet summer evening, the breeze gentle high above the streets and the sky over Chicago so clear it felt as though the entire city had paused to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Claire stood on the familiar penthouse balcony, the place that had borne witness to heartbreak, to long silences, and to the first flickers of hope that had once begun to rise between her and Nathan. Beneath her feet, the city lights shimmered like a river of gold, and behind her stood the man she had slowly learned to trust again, to forgive, and to love from the beginning. Nathan stepped out onto the balcony, carrying 2 glasses of wine, and in his eyes there was no longer the steely resolve she had once known so well, but something entirely human, entirely sincere. They leaned together against the railing, saying nothing for several minutes, as if silence itself was enough to understand all that needed to be said. Then Nathan set his glass down and turned to face Claire. He spoke, his voice not quite shaking, but steady enough to make her heart miss a beat. He said he knew he was not perfect, and that his love had never been perfect either. It had arrived too late, stumbled often, and carried its own share of pain. But if she was willing, he wanted the rest of his life to be a place where she would never have to run again. Nathan knelt. There was no glittering diamond, no spotlight, just a small velvet box with a simple silver ring inside, engraved with an Italian phrase he had once shared with her when speaking of his sister. Loosely translated, it meant love does not need to be perfect, only true. Claire did not cry. She did not tremble. She simply smiled, bent down, and whispered one word, yes. In that moment, every painful memory, every loss, every forgotten dream seemed to disappear into the wind. There was no applause, no falling petals or confetti, only 2 people who had once broken choosing to walk forward together, with nothing more than who they were and all they had to give. Love, in the end, does not need to be flawless. It only needs to be real. And that truth alone is what keeps 2 people standing side by side, through both their brightest days and their darkest seasons. This story may be just a single thread among countless other tales of love, but it carries something immense within it, that each of us has known pain, has lost faith, has once believed we might never love again, but if the heart still stirs, and we are brave enough to open it, then happiness will find us, in its own time, in its own way. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If today's story touched something in your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and sharing it so we can spread more meaningful stories together through Dear Single Mom. How did you feel following Claire and Nathan's journey? In your own life, have you ever stood at the edge between forgiveness and trust? between letting go and choosing to stay. We would be honored to hear your honest thoughts in the comments below. Do not hesitate to share, because sometimes your story might become the light someone else out there has been hoping to find. Goodbye for now. And we look forward to seeing you in the next video. Wishing you and your loved ones good health and a life filled with joy and peace each day. Take care. And until next time,